Welcome to Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle. I'm Bobby Owsinski, and this is a show all about music, music production, and the music business. My guest this week is mastering engineer Scott Hull. But first of all, the latest streaming rates across all of the various streaming platforms. You'll probably be surprised with what pays the most. And remember that these payout numbers are kind of an average. You can have two artists that have identical stream counts, and they'll have varying payouts because of a lot of factors that we'll go into in a little bit. First of all, number one for payouts at about 2.7 cents per stream. Believe it or not, it's Xbox Music. Behind that is Rhapsody at about 1.7 cents per stream. Tidal is behind that at about 1.3 cents per stream. Then it goes way down to Apple Music at almost 0.8 of a cent for each stream. Amazon Music comes after that at about 7.4 tenths of a cent. Deezer is about 6.2 tenths of a cent. Google, 6.1. Spotify is a lot lower than you might think. It's just about 4 tenths of a cent per stream. Pandora is way down there, and we'll talk about why in a second, but they're at a little more than 1/10 of a cent, basically 1.34 tenths. And YouTube, wow, about half that. They're at 0.00074 cents per stream. Now, if we look at the market share based on streams, we find that Spotify is number one at about 47, almost 48% of the market. After that comes Pandora at about 21% of the market. Then it really drops down. Apple Music comes after that at 10.5% of the market. After that is YouTube at 8.4% of the market. And then Google Play at 2.4% of the market. And then it really drops down from there. So basically what we have is Spotify, and then Pandora, then Apple Music, and sort of everybody else after that. Okay, so why are there different payouts per stream? Well, the biggest thing is how many tiers are there? There's a subscription tier where people pay, and then there's the free tier, which is ad-supported. So the ad-supported tier pays far less than what the subscription tier pays. So therefore, if most of your streams are coming from the free tier, then you're getting paid less. The next thing would be the country where your streams are coming from. Now, of course, it's $9.99 in the United States and a lot of the bigger countries in the world, but you'll find that China and Russia and some countries in South America and Africa, where people are only paying like $2 per month, and of course, they're paying in less, so the stream is worth less. Then there's the total stream count. So what happens is basically there's a whole pot of these streams that go in, and you're paid primarily on market share. So it all depends how many streams are in this big pot per country. And then the final thing, and this is what most artists and musicians and people that are kind of critical of the whole thing don't really think about, and that's the deal that you have with your record label and publishing. So don't forget that if they're taking 50% or more of what you're making, then you may be generating a pretty good amount of money, but the fact of the matter is, it's not really all going in your pocket. So that's the streaming rates for right now. Of course, it changes every year. It's very fluid, but this is what we know, at least for 2021. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. Don't forget about my music mixing primer and 101 mixing tricks programs that will help take your mixes to the next level. Go to bobbyowsinskicourses.com to learn more. Now here's something that's pretty disturbing. Bands are disappearing. Yeah, most of us that are listening grew up on bands and played in them, I'm sure. But guess what? There's fewer and fewer of them. Just go drive around your neighborhood and listen to how many garage bands you hear. Bet you don't hear any. And it's not like it used to be where there might be 3 or 4 that'd be playing. Hardly one now. But there's actually more definitive ways to look at this. If you look at the Billboard Global 100, there are only 5 out of the top 100 that are bands. Same thing with the U.S. top 100. And these bands are Maroon 5, Fleetwood Mac, Black Eyed Peas, Awesome City Club, and BTS. BTS is a boy band, so I don't know if you want to include them or not. And Black Eyed Peas aren't really players, so there you go. There's even fewer still. Festivals are the same, where you don't find bands that are headlining festivals anymore. So there's a number of reasons for this. One is it's a whole lot easier to become a solo performer. Anyone that's ever tried to start a band knows how difficult it is to find musicians that have the same vision and are willing to stick it out, especially during tough times. So it's a whole lot easier to just do it yourself, especially if you already have a lot of ideas. Now you can get those ideas out without having to rely on other people. It's a whole lot cheaper as well. You don't need expensive instruments like amplifiers and sound systems. You don't have to hire rehearsal space, and it sure is faster to make stuff than it is getting a band to sound good. Everything is faster in terms of decisions as well. A solo performer can make any kind of decision on their own, where you know what it's like with the band. Sometimes things can drag on and on and on, and you'll never actually get to the end of it. So that's another nail in the coffin of bands. A really big thing here is the fact that so many musicians today have grown up on rap and pop. So already they're thinking about solo artists because that's what they've learned from. That's what they've listened to. It's all about being a solo artist. So, of course, that's what they strive to be rather than being in a band. And also being on a band, you have to get on the road to build a following where you can just go on Ableton and crank something out if you have an idea and you're a musician. There's yet one other big thing here, and that's labels would rather sign solo artists than they would sign bands. Solo artists are less of a hassle. It's a whole lot easier. Labels have figured this out, so they're more than happy to have solo artists. So bands are in trouble. It sure would be nice if there are more of them, and hopefully the trend will turn around again, but as of now, bands are a dying breed. My guest this week is Scott Hull, who started his illustrious career in mastering at New York's famed Masterdisc Studios. Rising from an assistant to chief engineer, Scott then took a series of jobs at some of New York's most excellent mastering facilities, including Classic Sound and the Hit Factory, before striking out on his own. He returned to Masterdisc in 2008, this time as the owner, where he continues to cut digital and vinyl masters for a wide variety of artists. Scott has mastered records for Sting, Bruce Springsteen, Steely Dan, John Mayer, Bob Dylan, Miles Davis, and hundreds more. During the interview, we spoke about Scott's experience assisting the legendary Bob Ludwig, interpreting what a client means and describing what they hear, why the tools of mastering don't always work as well these days, getting used to different rooms, and much more. I spoke with Scott from his studio in Peekskill, New York. Tell me how you got started in the music business. Were you a player first, a musician?
I was a trombone player, played through school, played through college, got a performance degree on trombone, but also was in a recording technology program at SUNY Fredonia. And I had some really good luck there. I had a really good professor, David Moulton, who went on to do a lot of great things in the biz as far as education, maybe one of the best. And of his ilk. He was there all 4 years that I was there. And as just sort of fate would have it, one day I walked into his office and asked, maybe I should be doing an internship, you think? And he looked at me kind of funny, realized and then told me he'd just gotten off the phone with Bob Ludwig, who was looking for a summer intern. And so he said, well, what about Masterdisc? And I'm like, well, why not? Hadn't really, been planning on mastering as a long-term career. It was an option. After the internship, I realized, what amazing rarefied air to be hanging around in all day, every day. So, by the time my third favorite, most favorite producer, engineer, or artist walked through the door, I realized that's kind of where I wanted to be. So then the internship led to an assistantship, and digital recording was just coming around the corner within the next year or so after I started. To put it short, really, everyone else was busy cutting vinyl, and I was the guy who could take the manuals home and figure out how all of the digital stuff worked. And then I ended up teaching it, frankly, kind of teaching it to all the other guys and helping them use it. So I was the digital whiz kid, in 1984, 1985.
Do they teach you how to cut vinyl as well?
Yeah, well, that's all we did. I wasn't actively all that actively involved in vinyl, other than assisting on a day-to-day basis while vinyl was being cut, setting up the lathes, setting up the tape machine, certainly being directly involved, and had gotten to the point where I was cutting some of my own things and cutting some things with supervision. But yeah, I mean, just you learned it more by being there through osmosis, and I did learn a ton about disc cutting in those earlier days. Because that's what everything was about, was getting it on vinyl.
You had Bob Ludwig as a mentor, which is fantastic. It doesn't get any better than that. Do you think that it sped up the process for you? Because mastering is one of those things where it's an accumulation of experience, but being around him, did it speed everything up?
Well, it wouldn't be my perception. I suppose depending on who, what an alternate path might have been. It was close to 10 years of day-to-day working in mastering on mastering projects before I really was officially soloing on my own. Of course, I had mastered records. I had brought some things in of my own. I had gone out and fished for some of my own clients, but to actually have my name on the door and my name in the schedule book and had, booking time on par with the other engineers and masters, that was literally a 10-year haul. Kind of had to wait for someone to vacate a chair, to be quite frank. 93, when Bob left Masterdisc in New York and went to Gateway, that was the opportunity that I needed to be able to carve my own niche. I fill some really big shoes and carve my own niche at the same time. I had an interesting, I think a unique experience there is because I wasn't tied down to a particular room or an engineer, and I was assisting really all the engineers at different times at Masterdisc. I got to see really how everybody approached the project, the process. So in that respect, I saw and experienced a lot of different ways to do the same thing, and I think that was part of what I enjoyed about launching, going out on my own was figuring out what Scott would do. Because I knew what Howie would do, and I knew what Bob would do, I knew what Tony would do, and so I had to figure out what I wanted.
One of the things I ask every mastering engineer is, how long did it take you before you felt, yeah, I got this, I feel comfortable?
Ooh, tomorrow, maybe. Every day is a surprise. Every day is somebody else's baby being born. I know it sounds sort of like the academic answer, but it's honestly, some days are very humbling. Finding out that you're not necessarily the brightest ears in the room, and you got to figure out how someone else is hearing it or what they're hearing. I particularly resist the kind of general temptation to just to say, "Oh, it's not in there. You're hearing things." Or it can't be. I've been proven wrong so many times by people that were so much more clearly understood the music and their particular production than I did. Quite often, there's sometimes another reason. There's sometimes another explanation for the noises. But to say just because I'm not hearing them the way my clients are, doesn't mean that they're not there. So that was one thing that really kind of mattered to me. It was to always listen really carefully, not only to what the speakers were saying, but what my clients were saying.
So is this a taste thing you're talking about or technical?
Definitely the creative, the interpersonal issues and creative are really the things that I had not to struggle with, but the constant evolution of being a good listener, both to the speakers and to the clients, what they needed, and sometimes what they would say and what they wouldn't say or couldn't say. Some very notable producers and artists that I've worked with had very interesting ways of describing what they wanted or what they were hearing. And so I had to try to interpret that, create a sort of a truth table or a reference list of what does this person mean when he says crunchy? What does someone else mean when they say punchy? It's just, that becomes the challenge, really. I'd love to try to prove things, to prove, not only what I'm hearing, but to reference other things and go on. But ultimately it comes down to how the client's feeling about something. And so you have to always go with that.
So you worked at Masterdisc for 10 years before you basically got a chair. And then how long did it take before you became chief engineer?
That was a 3-year or so process, well, maybe a little less. It was the chief engineer role was more like chief technology officer at the time, because I was heavily involved in all of the Sonic Solutions rollouts, all the technology that connected the workstations together, training and installing. Sonic Solutions was the premier workstation at the time. It was the only one that really, kind of knocked the ball out of the park sonically, and with a waveform display that was crazy good. And it had a huge learning curve. So really, anybody that came along, came into the fold at Masterdisc had to either be trained on it. So that was my big role there. I think that was the reason why I was chief engineer there, not so much because I was the chief biller or the biggest name in the book. I was they all kind of relied on me to one degree or another. It really depends on who we're talking about, and I'm not trying to take credit for the other guys. I just know there was a need for somebody that was doing the business for the studio, not necessarily for themselves, and that was kind of my role, and that's why I had that title.
Then you left Masterdisc. Why did that happen?
Things changed. I had been principally involved in Greg Calby's coming and success at Masterdisc when he came from Sterling over to Masterdisc. And then his departure back to Sterling left a hole. I had some differences of opinion on a few items that I won't share, just to names to protect the people who aren't here to defend themselves. But some differences of opinion. It was becoming stale, and it was. I think it not only worn out my welcome, but it was going pretty stale with the fact that I didn't feel like I was achieving or performing at the level that I really could, because I was maybe putting out everyone else's fires and leaving mine ablaze. I even had occasional clients go to the owner and complain that I was being pulled out of my sessions too often to put out fires in other people's rooms. And the first time they thought it was novel. The second or third time they started looking in the yellow pages for another mastering studio.
Yeah.
But I really quickly, I was nervous, certainly, because I had been there my whole career up to that point. I say it would have been 15, just shy of 15 years, or six. I'm sorry, 93, 17, 18 years. But it's, I quickly found out that there was a lot of other opportunities out there. I just hadn't ever been asked and looking around. So that landed in a smaller place, but had the right kind of vibe. We were, interested in growth. Classic Sound was a studio that hadn't been known for pop mastering, but was well known. Tom Lazarus and Lazarus, I should say, a mixing and recording engineer, principally live classical recording, but was known for a lot of really great engineering. It's just a place so I could spread my wings, and really took off. That's why I did some of my bigger records of my career, really, in that next 3 or 4 years.
Then you went to Hit Factory. So that's completely different, because to be in a mastering facility, dedicated mastering facility, and then to be within the walls of an iconic big studio like that, different vibe. I
think I was trying on all the different suits, going around town trying on the different suits until I found one that fit. Hit Factory was very interesting. I mean, Troy had great plans of building the mastering department back up to what it had been in a heyday, 3 or 4 or 5 years earlier. And I think I was honestly intending to do that. Was we invest and bring some people on board and really make a notice of the thing because it had kind of languished. Chris Geringer and Tom Coyne had left, and Herb Powers, and there were some young mastering engineers there when I went there, and I was coming in as a young senior engineer, with more experience than a lot of them. But life turned a funny corner for the Germanos not long after I got there, and that opportunity kind of started to wilt.
Yeah.
And then we wrote it out until the studio was basically being closed and sold off. But that was my cue. It was my cue to buy my gear, buy the gear I was using, and set out on my own. My first space was a shared space on 44th Street, just a couple blocks away, and it went really well. Going on my own at that time, I had enough experience watching the businesses being run, and I still had 1,000 mistakes to make with regard to hiring people and salaries and setting rates and working too many hours and dealing with difficult clients. I still had plenty of mistakes to make, but I had quite a background at that point that I felt like I could dive in and how hard could it be?
Good attitude. Yeah, right.
Well, that was clearly proven wrong very quickly, but that was where I started.
And then coming back to Masterdisc as the boss.
That was an interesting twist. Through the years, I had been hearing from the engineers that Masterdisc was kind of declining, and and the ownership wasn't there full time and wasn't putting the kind of energy behind it that had been years before. And so a couple of the engineers that were still there kind of encouraged me to get into a conversation with the owner, and one thing led to another, and I was feeling pretty proud of myself for having built my little mastering, Scott Hall mastering, up from one room to, there's no rooms, to 3 rooms with 4 different engineers. And I thought we had a really good working environment, a really good crew. So my plan was to bring my crew over to Masterdisc and try to replicate that, try to keep that going. It was a crazy time. I mean, I tell people the story all the time. I literally got the keys to Masterdisc in June of 2008. And I think I was so concerned with all of that was going on with finances and all the things going on in my personal life and everything else that I hadn't really been paying attention. But I'm literally driving home with the keys after the closing, and I hear on the radio about this huge financial, doom and gloom that we were headed for. And I was immediately struck with what the heck did I just do?
Yeah, wow.
But it would have been too easy to quit and to just say it wasn't going to work. But I really thought, well, we had good income. We had pretty good revenue, pretty good steady revenue. We brought in Vlado, and we had a whole bunch of young engineers come through the space. But expenses just completely overrun our ability to make a profit. And I managed to keep it afloat, but it wasn't pretty for several years. 2014 then was my downsizing, and officially 2015 coming up here to Peekskill, New York, getting out of the city, because it appeared at that point that my clients were really scattered around the globe, and attended sessions were diminishing. And when I kind of took the best of the gear and the best of the people that were involved with what was going on at Masterdisc, I ended up with a pretty tight little ship. And so things have been okay. Things have been actually pretty good. And then, fortunately, with what we went through in 2020, being outside of the city and being in my own room and being completely independent has proved to be a really good thing. So I was able to work solo through a large chunk of the lockdown, taking care of clients that were still working, depending on which part of the world was open at that at that moment, whether it was the Far East or Europe or South America. Central America.
The mastering business in general has changed so much, especially in the last few years, where it seems like there's more indie clients than there are label clients. Do you find that to be the case?
I do. I think the label clients have really gravitated to a few really top tier names. There are a lot of a lot more indie clients that fortunately they really kind of need the knowledge that we have. Unfortunately, they also need a lot of education to understand what it is that we're doing and why. And I do an awful lot of re-educating just to get projects in the door so that they have a chance of surviving the process. I'm not one to just kind of put a stamp on it and stand it back out and say, well, that sucks, but that's about as good as it can be. I'm really more of I really get into the nitty gritty with I really can't say younger clients, but people that haven't been doing it for that many years or have suddenly moved their work environment to a home or production environment. Any one of these that are a little less experienced, I'll really kind of dig in and try to find some way that I can help them make their mix better, make the master process work better for them.
Is there one particular problem that you keep on coming up with in those situations?
I almost feel like we're beating this drum to death, but it's still really this mixing into or too hard into a limiter. Really, the situation that just keeps coming up over and over again. Every master engineer has their own sort of way of responding to it. Like why you got to leave us some headroom. You got to we can't put the icing on the cake. It's all ready for us. Whatever kind of way you like to say it, but quite frankly. The tools of mastering don't work as well if the mix has already been heavily limited. And just because it's loud doesn't mean the tone's right. And so if the tone controls don't work as well, it can really be an issue. But there's this huge caveat. If the mixer has mixed through the limiter and made his mix decisions based on the settings and the effects of the limiter, they'll comply and take the limiter off the tube bus, but then the mix sounds awful. And then they're wondering why I can't fix it for them because they've taken away, all of they've undone the decision making. I look at it this way. If your release is for digital only, you kind of can do whatever you want to do. That's if you want to present a really high volume master mix, that's fine. There's definitely some compromises that come into play there, and we can talk about them on a more subtle basis. But if you're producing for vinyl, you're really tying our hands, really quite simply not producing the best mix for vinyl that you could be making. And it's really, in my opinion, not as a mixer, but as a master engineer, but my opinion is to make your mix without the limiter and then, add the limiter, add the loudness, add your average level that you need for competitive, whatever, once you've got your mix together. So that kind of goes back to controlling the dynamics on a track by track basis, not just relying on a stereo bus compressor to pull your mix together. It's said from a point of experience in like what makes a mix work well on vinyl. There's certainly plenty of very notable producers and mixers that will disagree with me on the process. I could rattle off several names that I'm sure you already know, people that really mix to a particular loudness level, and that's when their mix is done. So that's really all you're going to get. That's really how it's going to turn out. But analog and the lathe is a different beast. There's always another side to it. We can cut anything. It's just a question of whether it really turns out the best that it could have. Or there are compromises.
I want to come back for a second because you talked about, you've gone through different studios and working in different rooms. How did you find that in terms of getting used to a particular room?
I honestly have the feeling like I'm quite adaptable. And I don't think I was really born with that. I think the practice of moving from room to room and having to adapt gave me, caused me to become better at that skill. So I have recordings, masters that I've made throughout the years that are kind of my go-to. They're my baseline. it's kind of an interesting eclectic group of songs because I have a really wide range of styles of clients that I work with, and so it's not a sound. It's more like extremes. I have a master that was done for Edie Brickell that has more bass on it than anything else that I've ever done. And that really, and I know how that sounded in the room. I remember how it sounded in the room that I was familiar with. And it sounded like it was a little bit ready to blow up. It had so much round bottom, but it was mixed to 1-inch analog. They wanted it to be big. And my goal there was to just, leave as much bass in it as absolutely possible. And that's so records like that. I have another one that's got like a bright vocal that will almost peel paint. And and so it's kind of peculiar. I can always play the stuff that sounds good, but if I'm in a new room, I want to know if it's going to tell me that the stuff that sounds questionable, I can identify what's wrong with it or what's right about it in those rooms. So it's a little bit different process of moving as a mixer moving from room to room, which you might have to do, on a daily basis. This is needing to be able to hear, a half dB or even a quarter dB of EQ, across the majority of the spectrum and be able to, really know you're hearing the difference. I guess the other way of saying it is I tweak the rooms until I can do that. I honestly, none of my rooms have been shot out to be roll or flat or to meet a particular standard. They're all different. If you study my work chronologically, though, I don't think you hear a big change. There are some changes from the Masterdisc era, especially the Hit Factory era, because my room was changing like the whole time I was there. I was working in 2 or 3 different rooms, and I only for about 6 months did I actually have a room that stopped changing. So that era was one that was kind of difficult to nail down. But on the rooms that I get comfortable with, it's about a 2-week process for me to get comfortable. And the ultimate test is when my clients stop asking for revisions. Oh. when I send them back something and they're happy with it, then I know I'm really getting close. Or at least I'm within their tolerance. So then I go for a little further, tweak it to my satisfaction.
Are you using the same monitors that you've used for a long time?
That's the key to this. I've brought exactly the same monitors and amplifiers between all of my rooms since the first iteration of Masterdisc. They're the Sovereign, Duntech Sovereign 2000s that are sitting behind me. Were quite popular within certain realms at mastering. They just become the way I hear now. So I know that there's better speakers or more accurate or more even more transparent, but these are how I hear. And so anything else would be a much longer learning curve. I'm almost superstitious about changing my speakers at this point.
Yeah, I could see why. You get used to those and you don't want to change.
Yeah. I'm actually a little careful about changing drivers. If I try not to change a whole bunch of things all at once. I think our ear and our brain kind of fills in the gaps. If you make small changes, it will, it automatically sort of allow you to adjust. When you make a big change, then all the doubt and uncertainty comes in, and it changes the way you hear. And I don't know. What do you think? And then all of a sudden, you're not a mastering engineer anymore.
Yeah. Do you do different masters for streaming than for CD? Or I know obviously you're going to do a separate one for Apple Masters, but besides that,
well, it's a tricky one because we still have loudness concerns and loudness competition for digital downloads and CD, or when people are combining songs from different artists into playlists. Streaming that now is a pretty well understood, loudest normalized environment where the loudest thing in is not going to be the loudest thing on playback, and it really you lose quite a bit in terms of the fidelity of the tune by going for the loudest kid on the block. But there's still a concern if a producer deems. I had a recent client that deemed their acceptance into playlists was going to be a significant way that new people are going to find out about this artist or about this song. and they wanted it to be the loudest thing in the playlist, and so that it was. I kind of went along with them kicking and screaming, but because it certainly wasn't the best sounding version of their song, but they had a goal in mind. They needed it to be loud in everyone's playlist in a non-loudness normalized environment. That's still a thing. So the answer to the question is sometimes. Generally, we're looking for something that's a good working and good loud that doesn't destroy the music and that is still doesn't take too much of a penalty or loudness hit, when it's streamed. I don't know if my approach is still universal or not. I know a number of people who used to do it this way. The last time I checked, last time we had a conference where everybody got together and talked about these things, but it would seem to be just a little bit over the LUF standard for Spotify. Just enough to not be too to not take too much of a penalty, but still have it be appropriately loud and competitive. I'm not a big fan, to be completely honest. I'm not a big fan of trying to make things loud. I usually I'm on the other side of this, trying to argue all of the positive points for dynamics and for continuity and realism, but that doesn't. It doesn't float with everybody I work with.
Yeah, what's so funny about that? If you go to a hi-fi show or just even any kind of speaker demonstration at a conference, and the demo material that they play and what makes people ooh and ah are the things with the most dynamic range that we absolutely love, and yet that's not the way popular ears are hearing it.
Yeah, there's a bit of an age, a generational thing there, but it's also a habit, just like. I used the analogy the other day. It's just like too much salt. You have no idea that you're using too much salt because it's in your diet every day. And until you get used to having none, then again, then after a few weeks of that, then you actually can taste the salt.
Yeah,
taste a subtle amount of seasoning. I found compression was by far more like our brains tuned it out. If you heard music with a lot of compression. To the point where you really didn't even hear the compression anymore, unless you reprogrammed your brain on acoustic music and uncompressed music. And I've gone through that a phase a couple times in my career, where working on pop music endlessly, and then walking into an environment that was more of a classical or a modern or neoclassical environment, and being being kind of politely reprimanded for too much use of compression. And I was like, it doesn't sound like it's compressed at all. Then obviously realizing that I had become quite immune to it. The consumer is immune to it as well, of course.
Yeah. With all of the very powerful mastering tools that are available to just about anybody these days, if you have a digital audio workstation, and most people not knowing, what to do with them and considering how powerful they are. I look at behind you and I see you have a nice complement of analog and digital outboard gear.
Yeah.
And that is the differentiator between what you do and what somebody could do at home. And yet they think that they can match what you do.
Well, there's always the feeling that it's not so much the tool, it's the experience, it's the application.
Yeah.
We all love the old story of the carpenter and the finding the right spot to put the nail on the floor. And, there's the board that squeaked for years and suddenly one nail fixed it, and we had some other euphemisms that were a little less politically correct, but so I'll save them. But the point being, would I come up with roughly the same masters if I just worked in the box? At this point, it's close. But there are days when my analog tools destroy the best thing I can come up with. Just absolutely, so much better than the best thing I can come up with plugins. On certain types of music, I still will work up both and kind of try to do a fair analysis of the two. I really try really hard not to talk myself into liking the plugins because they're easier and faster. I work one up as if I had one client and work up the other chain as if it was for another client. And then I sit back and listen to the two, and occasionally send two versions to the client to get their feedback on them. Usually not telling them what the differences were, just letting them decide which approach suits them better. The tools sometimes change your approach. And then, of course, we have our favorite settings on all this gear. So you kind of reach for the Sontec EQ for a particular kind of noise, and reach for the Avalon for a certain kind of sheen or kind of width or depth. And so if those tools, if those particular settings don't work, and you experiment around with some other things, you reach for another tool. And sometimes it's easier to just try something else. And I would say I'm still much higher percentage out of the box than in the box. Probably pretty darn close to 80% out of the box. Even though there's projects where I'll use both. There happens to be some curves in the Weiss digital, digital EQ that I can't really replicate in analog without artifacts. So when I want to do certain maneuvers in the bass, or particularly one particular thing is a very broad upper mid-range thing that it really can only be done with that, or with a certain really high-end plugins. The analog gear just doesn't kind of do that. Most of the analog gear doesn't do that really, really broad tone control stuff. It's more, it was built to be more critical, more parametric.
Last question, Scott. If anybody is qualified to answer this, I think it's you, considering what you've gone through in your career. What's the best piece of business advice that you either learned along the way or maybe somebody imparted to you?
Ooh, there's a couple. The first one that jumps into my head was a brother-in-law of mine that had his Master of Business Administration and was working for Wall Street. And I told him that I was going on my own. He just said, "Get comfortable being uncomfortable." That was after I told him all my plans for having my own business and having people doing work with me and beside me was going to allow me more freedom to pursue other things. And his chuckle still lives with me. I still hear it every day. No one will deny that it's a whole lot of work. It is a lot of fun, though. I do get a lot out of proving everybody wrong on a day-to-day basis. I managed to pull this off and actually, have a, pretty decent living out of it. One thing that was fairly important to me from years ago, and one of the reasons why mastering was appealing, is that there was some stability to it. There was some uniformity. There was a regular work hours type environment. Certainly there were exceptions, but we weren't on the road, touring and living out of vans and buses. So I kind of in hindsight missed some of that, but I guess I got my fill of that in my college collegiate jazz ensemble, where we ripped up New York State from one end to the other in tour buses for 3.5 years. But other business advice, wow, it's kind of classic stuff. It's your gut's probably telling you what's really going on, so you just got to figure out how to take your own advice. Almost every change that I've had to make, I knew I had to make it months, if not years earlier. I just was resistant to change.
That's a good one.
Yeah. You probably know your reaction. You probably already know what you need to be doing, but it's hard to convince yourself of that. I guess that maybe the last one is not everything that seems like a great idea needs to be pursued. I have really tried to do just about everything that comes across my desk, and still kind of guilty of that. I still, not that I want to give up anything else that I'm doing, but I don't want to be late to the party. So I'm always trying to kind of stay current. I mean, I started this career as the computer and digital, the local, the in-house computer hotshot, and so I still feel like I'm trying to catch up to technology.
Yeah, welcome to the club.
Exactly.
You can find out more about Scott at masterdisc.com. That's master, M-A-S-T-E-R, disc, D-I-S-K, masterdisc, all one word, .com, or you can go to scotthullmastering.com, Scott, S-C-O-T-T, Hull, H-U-L-L, mastering, scotthullmastering.com. Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. To listen to the episodes of Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle, go to bobbyowsinski.com and select the podcast tab, or go to bobbyowinnercircle.com, or find it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Mixcloud, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Deezer, TuneIn Radio, Radio Public, and Podbean. At bobbyowsinski.com and bobbyowinnercircle.com, you'll also find a sign-up form for my newsletter and for alerts for new podcasts. This is Bobby Owsinski. I will see you next time.